Hello, everyone. This is the 75th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley, England. For this episode, we interview English author Mr. Robert Fielder as we discuss the 1980 UEFA European Championships. Mr. Fielder is the author of The Complete History of the World Cup and The Complete History of the European Championship. Welcome.
Morning, both.
Morning, and thank you for joining us. Could you just introduce yourself and tell us about your early football memories and history with the game?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, as the intro said, I'm Rob Fielder, author of The Complete History of the World Cup and The Complete History of the European Championships. I've been watching football since probably the late 80s or so. Really, Italia 90 was the moment, as it is for, I think, many people of my generation, which was the sort of catalyst for my addiction to football. Following England through that tournament and the rest of it was a sort of remarkable ride, and really was the starting point of my love for the game. And since then, I've never stopped, really. So after that, as a child, football was pretty much everything, and always has been since then. So I've been writing about football on message boards and blogs and the books for probably about 20 years or so now, something like that. And yeah, it's always been a passion, not just contemporary football, but the history of the game. So I've got a love of history in general, and I'm fascinated on quite a what might sound quite base level of who was the best. That's kind of the angle that I come at, and I think who was the best is naturally leads you down the path of the historical side of the game, and trying to understand more about the great players that have been there in the past, the great teams. So that's probably a little bit of an introduction to myself.
Thank you.
Let's discuss the 1980 Euros. The 1980 Euros were the first to be hosted like a proper tournament. Can you describe the format of the previous Euros and the need for the evolution to this new format?
Yeah, so as you say, the Euros had a very sort of long birth. So it had first been talked about having a European Championship back in the 20s or so. And I mean, the British Home Championship had started in the 1880s. So there'd been quite a long build-up. People were talking about a World Cup, and there were various sort of international friendlies in Europe in the start of the 20th century. It wasn't until 1960 that the first European Championships took place. And as you say, it was a straight knockout competition for the early stages. It was quite chaotic because a lot of teams didn't want to actually take part, similar to the World Cup. I think we always look back on these things now, and it's hard to envisage a time when people wouldn't have wanted to participate. But it was quite chaotic. So the first tournament, they were struggling for numbers. Lots of the teams didn't want to take part, and it ended in a 4-team tournament. And that was the format which stayed in place from then on. So it was 4 teams, it was straight semi-finals, third place playoff, and a final. And I think there was a growing sense that Europe could do more than that. So the World Cup had expanded it was due to expand in 1982. So that they already knew about that, and that had been set out for a time to come. And the Euros, the 1976 edition of the Euros, had been an absolutely spectacular tournament. So that's one of the really great forgotten tournaments. We don't really think about it now. Nobody ever really talks about 1976 as a great tournament. It was absolutely fantastic. There were lots of goals, lots of incident. There were lots of extremely dramatic matches in that. Even though it was only a 4-team tournament, it packed a hell of a lot in to that time. And so I think there was a growing sense that Europe could do more. They were already sending more than 8 teams to the World Cup. I think as well, there was a sense at that time that the rest of the world was getting an unfair crack of the whip at the World Cup. So Europe had kind of dominated alongside South America for a very long time. I think if you read some of the contemporary sources, there's almost a suggestion that even though Europe was still getting the majority of the places at the World Cup, that the rest of the world, particularly Africa and Asia, shouldn't really be getting any of the places almost. I think there was that sort of that pride and sense within Europe that we, if you like, should have all of the pie. And that sort of persists to this day a little bit. And so I think there was an idea that the Euro should be expanded to kind of reflect the growing power of the continent.
There certainly was the feel of a mini World Cup with 8, presumably the top teams in Europe with this format.
That's right. And I think it reflected that massively. I mean, we went from having 4 games to having 15 games or so. And that, well, actually, there weren't 15 games in this one because there weren't semi-finals, but that was kind of what we built to, so in time. And it really did give a lot more opportunity. And I think before, the qualifying process had been extremely tight. We'll come on, I think, later to talk about some of the teams who were there this time. And lots of them hadn't been making tournaments as a matter of course. And I think that was a real opportunity for them. And it was I wouldn't say it was necessarily seen as being a money spinner, but more just an opportunity for some of these top teams to get there. And I think it provided certainly looking back in retrospect, it provided a much better tournament where more stuff could happen. There was a bigger chance for teams, bigger chance for the best teams to prove what they could do over a longer period of time. And I think it's certainly in looking back, it was the format, at least, moving to a tournament and group stages was a big step.
So let's briefly describe the 8 qualifying nations and start with Group A. Can you describe the evolution of the defending champions, Czechoslovakia, since 1976?
Yeah, I think they were a side who probably had gone back a little bit. So the 76 result was a bit of a shock, it's fair to say. I think of all the teams who were present in 1976, I don't think they were necessarily expected to win, but they had the core of a very good side at the time. I think after that, they had regressed a little bit. I think particularly the loss of the goalkeeper, Whittle. I think he was an outstanding figure, one of the best figures in their history. I think the loss of him was a bit of a setback. But I think, they still had some players, but they were a little bit older by this point in time. Obviously, 4 years had passed. And I think that Anton Ondras, the central defender, he was getting on a little bit. I mean, I think it's funny to say now because I think players' life cycles have increased a lot compared to where they were in the 70s. We had in the sort of 50s, you had people like Stanley Matthews playing in their 40s and winning the Ballon d'Or. And then I think the time period of a player's career around the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s really compressed in. I think by the time that somebody was 30, they were kind of past it, generally speaking. And I think Ondras was about 31 at this point. It seems weird to say now when we've got people like Benzema and Lewandowski and Messi and Ronaldo excelling in their sort of mid-30s now. But yeah, he was seen as being a little bit past it. I think going forward, they had quite a lot still. People like Nahoda was good. I mean, obviously everyone will remember Panenka from the 1976 victory. I think he was also another one who was a little bit past his best at that point. I mean, he was never, even in his prime, he was never a particularly sort of energetic player. He relied a lot more on his sort of craft and guile. But I think by this point, he was a little bit slow. But they did have quite a lot in attack. They had Vizek, I think, had come through. Marian Masny was a very good player of that era. And they still had the core, but I think people didn't really look at them as coming in as favourites.
And they were managed by Josef Venglos, who later had a spell in, a couple of spells in British football. The Aston Villa experiment wasn't too successful. Before his time, maybe. Yeah.
Let's talk about tournament favorites, West Germany. After a disappointing 1978 World Cup, they were now under the leadership of Joop Derwaal. Can you describe the team's progress since?
Yeah, I think, as you say, Helmut Schön had moved on, having had a very long spell in charge, and Derwaal had been cultivated for the role for some time. I think West Germany were in a little bit of a transition period, in that obviously the likes of Beckenbauer was, long gone now. This was not the side who had won the tournament back in 1972 or had won the World Cup in 1974. It was very much the start of a new era. I think at this time, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge was coming through as being, if not the premier player in Europe, then one of the absolute best. He was an absolutely fabulous player. The blend of physicality and technicality that he brought to the game was exceptional. And I think this was his absolute prime. He was in here, this sort of three to 4 year period around sort of 78 through to 82 in particular. And this 80 to 82 was his absolute prime, I think. I think they had a lot of good players. Uli Stierlicher was an exceptional player, could play in central defence, could play in defensive midfield. But I think they were missing some of the old heads. I mean, Manny Kaltz as well at this point was a tremendous player. Hamburg right back, could also play in central defence. But it felt like they were missing something a little bit. Now, I think as we all know, maybe this has been built up over the last 40 years or so, you can never discount the Germans or the West Germans, because I think they've just got that tournament experience. I think at this time as well, West Germany was probably the strongest league in Europe in terms of the depth. Their teams consistently did well in the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup, and particularly in the late 70s, they'd done well in the European Cup, even if they'd been taken over by England at that point in terms of actually winning it. So I think they had a lot of good players. I think there was a lot of hope around people like Hansi Müller, around, I'm sure we'll come to talk about Bernd Schuster as well later on in it, because he was one of the sort of unexpected stars of the tournament. But there was hope around them, but they didn't have that sort of all-conquering aura that they sometimes possess. But they were one of these teams that they always line up among the favourites.
Let's also mention that for the goalkeeper, veteran Sepp Maier had been involved in a car accident that essentially ended his career earlier in that season. After a few experimentations, Derval had settled for Harald Schumacher. So this was a tournament where he came into his zone for West Germany. Also, another veteran, Rainer Bonhoff, was set to participate, but a last-minute injury ruled him out. Same with Klaus Fischer, another player who would be one of the stars of the 1982 World Cup. But that gave the opportunity for Horst Hrubesch to shine in these Euros.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we will come on to it, I'm sure, but what an impact he had. A very different type of player to Fischer. Fischer was very dynamic and acrobatic, and that sort of more of a sort of poacher, whereas Hrubesch was a sort of classic target man, really very physically imposing, and it was. But it sort of illustrates the strength and depth that the Germans had in that sort of position, because they had the likes of Klaus Allofs as well, and they had that depth throughout it. The ability to swap in Harald Schumacher, who would become a very big figure in the 1980s in terms of the sort of world collective knowledge of football. He's got a big part to play in the history of the game, and certainly Sepp Maier at that point in time was seen as being one of the great goalkeepers of all time, and certainly he still is. So that was a cruel loss, but they had the depth to replace those players, and probably that was one of the things which differentiated them from some of the other sides.
And next we have the Netherlands, the 1974 and 78 World Cup finalists. Was it evident at this time that they were a fading force?
I think in the personnel, you think about the players who'd really excited at the 1974 World Cup in particular, obviously Cruyff, but Neeskens as well weren't there. I think if you look at the 1978 World Cup, Rob Rensenbrink had been an absolute superstar at that, and is probably one of the most underrated players in football history, I would say, because he was an absolutely exceptional player. They'd lost Wim Jansen as well, had moved to the States. Everyone was in the States, and people who could do well. I mean, even Ruud Krol, who was a tremendous player and really evolved. I think often we think of him as being the fullback or centre-back that he was a lot of the time for the Netherlands in club football, in national team football. But, at club football, he became an absolutely terrific central midfielder around this sort of period of time when he moved to Napoli. At this point, I think he was with the Vancouver Whitecaps as well, which seems weird to say about one of the best players in world football at this point. But that they'd lost a lot of players at that point. I think they still had star quality. They had the Van der Kerkhoff brothers. They had Johnny Rep still. Up front, they still had some players who looked like they could be really good, but they didn't feel like quite the force of before, and they weren't bringing with them all of that experience. And I think if you, certainly looking back after the event, it's easy to say this, but this was when the Dutch went into a bit of a fallow period afterwards, where the bridging the gap between the generation of Cruyff, Neeskens, Van Hanegem, Krol, through to the Rijkaard, Koeman, Van Basten generation. So there was a bit of a gap, I would say, here.
The last team in Group A was Greece, who had eliminated Hungary and the Soviet Union. They were nevertheless an unknown quantity. What can be said about them?
I think unknown quantity is the right summary, to be honest. And I think certainly, in Britain, the British perspective was people were talking about the Panathinaikos team that had got to the European Cup final about 9 years earlier under Ferenc Puskás and had lost to Ajax as being, well, that's a reference to Greece that kind of we can remember. There weren't really there were no real star players. I think Anastopoulos, Mavros, Galakos were the names which people were plucking out of the air as being people who'd impressed. I think the Soviet Union completely collapsed in qualifying. They just hadn't really turned up and had really disappointed. They were in, as you say, they were in a group with Hungary, who were handy at that point in time. They still hadn't quite transitioned into that irrelevance which really gripped them after about 1986 or so. But there weren't really too many stars in there. I think Neil Assey was still coming through at that point, and they had a few decent players, Fazekas as well. But it was a group with them, the USSR, Finland, who were not a force at the time, and I think Greece kind of snuck through as the best of that. So they were, as you say, quite unexpected, and I don't think a lot was particularly expected of them or known about them.
Moving on to Group B, let's start off with host Italy. A positive World Cup in 1978 should have carried the team into the Euros. But can you describe the event just before the tournament that completely derailed the hosts?
Yeah, so there'd been, and younger listeners will see these sort of eerie comparisons with the 2006 World Cup here, but there'd been a match-fixing scandal, and it's called Totonero, and where basically players had conspired together to try and fix what was the sort of Italian equivalent of the pools. And it had particularly impacted on Lazio and Milan. But in terms of the Italian national side, I think the huge impact was the absence of Paolo Rossi. I think, again, often we look at this from a current day viewpoint and we see the redemption of Rossi in 1982 World Cup. I think at the time, he had been a tremendous player at the 1978 World Cup, which I think, again, is often forgotten. I think 78 is certainly in the English consciousness, not a World Cup that's particularly well remembered. It was on at the wrong time. England weren't in it. There weren't all that many sort of superstar performers, but he was terrific. And the combination that he had with Roberto Bettega in attack for Italy was really one of the high points of that tournament. They really worked well together, and I think that was a huge miss. Rossi. They scored a lot of goals at that tournament. They could have scored a lot more. They were quite unlucky. So that was a really big setback. I think, again, now we sort of build up this idea that Italian football excels in adversity and that they're almost, I don't know, not quite the Millwall of international football, but they like that siege mentality. I don't know if that was really true at the time. And certainly on a home, when you're hosting yourselves, I think it was certainly less than ideal basis for preparation. At the same time, they did still have a hell of a side. Almost all of the names that we're familiar with from the 1982 World Cup were already there. They were in a very strong position. Juventus were already providing the sort of backbone and side as they continued to do have done throughout the history, really. But the defence in particular was exactly what you would expect it to be. You had obviously Dino Zoff in goal. There were some questions about Dino Zoff at this point. I think the 1978 World Cup had not been a high point for him. He let in 3 goals from long range. And I think, that was a susceptibility that sort of stayed with him and that carried through into this tournament a little bit, into the 1982 World Cup as well. But he was, we talked before about older players. I think goalkeepers were the exception, but he was certainly getting on at this point in time. But you had Scirea, Gentile, Tardelli was there in midfield. Cabrini was already there as well. So, you had the nucleus of a side, a really, really strong side who would go on to demonstrate how good they were in 1982.
Totonero obviously impacted on the team itself, but I believe it also had an effect on the attendances for this tournament, which we'll maybe discuss in a bit more detail later on.
Yeah.
Now let's discuss England under Ron Greenwood. Astonishingly, this was their first participation to any final since 1970. Describe the team's chances at this point, having been so many years away from any finals.
Yeah, it's remarkable looking back, isn't it? Is that I think England went into the 1970 World Cup with this idea that maybe this was a better team than the side who had won the 1966 World Cup. And you look at the players that they had throughout the decade, certainly it's a decade which is fondly remembered in English football. There's lots of mavericks, incredibly talented players that we look back on, and there's an enormous amount of success as well on a club level. This was the start of the era in which English sides really started to dominate in the European Cup. Liverpool, Nottingham Forest had at this point won, a series of European Cups, albeit it should be mentioned with a nucleus, both of those sides, of Scottish players. So, it wasn't like it was purely an English team at the time. There were a number of Scots in there. But really, you look back at the 70s and you think, how on earth did England not make it to a single finals? But then if you go through them individually, 1972, they lost in the quarterfinals to West Germany. And that was a West Germany who were probably better than the 74 World Cup winners. You had Günter Netzer in his absolute prime. That year, Beckenbauer was superb. Muller was superb as well. So that I think England were a little bit past their best, but no disgrace in that. 74, you had the Tomaszewski moment and Clough, and they lost out to a team who went on to show the world in that World Cup that they were an exceptional team. 76, they lost out to Czechoslovakia in qualifying. 78, they lost out to Italy, who would go on to have such a fine tournament and clearly had a really good side. So looking back now, when almost, particularly with the Euros, everyone qualifies. You've got to do something really special to not make it to the Euros. And the World Cup even, with however many teams Europe are sending at the moment, around 13 sides or so, it's a lot harder, whereas the Euros in particular, it was 4 teams that make it to the finals. And I think that's probably an illustration of what we were talking about at the start, the need for the better teams to be in these tournaments. I think England, since Don Revie had gone, under Ron Greenwood, they'd changed a bit stylistically. I think Ron Greenwood obviously is from the West Ham school of football, so it's more positive, creative, technical than Revie's Leeds were. I think at the same time as well, he had a nucleus of good players in the side, a lot of technical ability in there. People like obviously Keegan, not so technical necessarily, but I think Keegan is a really interesting case. In England, often when you speak to people overseas, they regard Keegan, this double Ballon d'Or winner, as being one of the great players in football, because he pops up on lists because he's won the Ballon d'Or twice. Whereas in England, he is never, ever in the consideration for any sort of discussion of being one of the best players England have ever produced. Because weirdly, I think he lacked that maverick tendency, that technical ability. People often say he made the best of himself, which to me is always actually a great attribute. He really harnessed the powers he had. I think at this point, he was absolutely in his prime. Maybe not quite this season, but this was his peak era. He'd come off, he'd won 2 Ballon d'Ors. He'd been in the running in 77, 76 as well. And alongside Tony Woodcock as well, he'd got that experience from playing in West Germany, which, as I said, was probably alongside England, the best league in the world at that point in time. So I think he was a really well-rounded player. I think there was a lot of technical quality in midfield. People like Trevor Brooking, a young Glenn Hoddle was part of this side as well. There were people like Terry McDermott, who again was quite underrated technically. I think he was seen as being quite a sort of physically dominant presence, but actually was a really, really good passer, similar to Graham Souness in a way, in that sort of gave that image of being a hard man, but was actually really technically good. I think England had the foundations. They had 2 phenomenal goalkeepers. I think almost any other team in the tournament would have been delighted to have had either Clements or Shilton, and England had both of them. So I think there was a lot there, but I think that lack of tournament experience, as you say, probably counted against them a little bit.
The main absentee for England was Trevor Francis, who had to withdraw due to a ruptured Achilles.
Yeah, a big, real shame that for Trevor Francis, because he was in terrific form. The impact that he'd had at Forest since his move for £1 million was enormous. He had pace, he was direct. He's quite a hard player to categorise, I think, because he kind of played on the right midfield for Forest, but he was almost a forward or a striker at the same time. A slightly odd one, but he was an exceptional player, and I think he would really have frightened teams across Europe who would have seen what he'd done in the European Cup for Forest.
Yeah, I think illustrating the talent that England had available, then there was a lot of discussion. Most of the contemporary debate was about the wingers or lack of, and I think this was one of the criticisms of Ron Greenwood, that he was always a little cautious in his selections. And there was both Peter Barnes and Laurie Cunningham, both faded really a little bit after this, but both at that time were more or less in their prime and weren't selected for that squad. Do you think that might have changed the nature of England's chances and performances?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's that sort of natural suspicion, isn't there, in England? I think, although I just said again, it's that strange trade-off there. I said that the sort of criticism of Keegan is often that he doesn't possess those maverick tendencies, and yet at the same time, successive England managers have always struggled to fit in all the best players. You look at the Brazil 1970 side of, let's get all 5'10s in together, whereas successive England managers were like, well, we can't have him and him. We can't have Gascoigne and Waddle or Hoddle or Barnes, or and this is true in this era as well. I think is how do you keep the handbrake on whilst just easing it off? And you can see it in today's Gareth Southgate side as well a little bit. Not to get too far forward, but there's the natural suspicion, and you just don't want to push it too much. I think had England been a bit more positive here, maybe that would have helped. You can certainly see that coming through in the 1982 World Cup as well a little bit.
Moving on to what would be the surprise team of these Euros, that would be Belgium under Guy Thys.
Yeah, I think they were an interesting team, not really very well fancied at all beforehand. They'd been a bit similar to England. They'd been good in around 70, 72. They'd hosted the 1972 European Championships. They'd been impressive at the 1970 World Cup as well. Even if they haven't gone all that far in it. As you say, Guy Thys had taken over from Raymond Goethals, who'd been in there for a long time and was regarded as very, very impressive manager. Guy Thys, at the time, I think there was a bit of suspicion. His place wasn't that secure. I think had they not qualified for this tournament, he might well have been out quite early on, which is funny because looking back, he's seen as being one of the great managers, and would go on to have a lot of success with Belgium throughout the 1980s and particularly in this tournament as well. This, I don't think we appreciated it at this point in time. This was the start of the original golden generation for Belgium. There were lots of good players. Getting the very tail end of Wilfried van Moore's career, who was a marvellous player, conducted everything in midfield. He'd suffered with a terrible injury at the start of the 1970s in a game against Italy, where he'd broken his leg. And it was out for almost 2 years or so after it. But he'd come back, and he was, by this point in time, he was an elder statesman, to put things politely for it. He was certainly seen as quite old, I would say, but had really lost none of the quality that he had. I think alongside him in attack, Vandenberg and Van der Elst were two of the best forwards in Europe at this point in time. I think Francois Van der Elst was seen as being an extremely talented individual. He was about to make a big move to America as well. So the Americans were really going shopping in the Low Countries at this point in time, and had a lot of quality. People like Gerrits would go on to be a mainstay of the national team for a decade to come, and was an excellent player at right back. Walter Mews was a very good player as well, and the one that was a real breakout player of the tournament, but we wouldn't know at this point, Jan Keulemans, who again would for a whole decade dominate. And he was such a physically imposing player. He was tall, he was strong, he was quick, he could run all day. He really was that sort of prototypical modern player. Probably a bit of a transition. It's interesting to see him and Van Moor in the same side together, in that they were kind of the antithesis of each other. And as we move from the, not to say the 80s didn't have them, the 80s had a lot of these players around, but there was much more physicality coming through from people like Keulemans.
Regarding Belgium, that in England at least they were sort of characterised as being hard to beat and relying on an effective offside trap. But do you think that maybe did them a bit of a disservice? There was more to them than that.
A little bit. I mean, the Belgian league was really, really strong at this point as well. So they were playing in a domestic league, which was very, very good. Anderlecht were a really strong side. It seems so strange today to say this, because the Belgian league is quite a weak league relatively. It's not one in which they are importing top quality players. But at the time they were, people like Rensenbrink were playing in the Belgian league. They could go and recruit other people. And so the domestic league was strong. I think that probably was doing them a bit of a disservice, but at the same time, I don't think a lot was necessarily expected from them here.
Let's come to the last team in Group B, Spain, under the management of Ladislas Kubala. He had been in charge since 1969. How were their chances regarded?
I think it's funny that he had been in since 1969 because he hadn't really done anything. And you think in the sort of modern era where we're so fast to sack managers, that his time in charge had not really achieved. I mean, they'd been at the 1978 World Cup. They were clearly seen as being a decent team, but they were still seen, I think, as being one of those teams who just didn't replicate the quality of their club sides. I think the 70s had been a bit of a fallow period for Spanish football. I think the decision to ban foreigners had really cut the legs out from underneath their club sides. So, that was a big factor. I mean, they'd won the 1964 European Championships and they were a handy side in 1966 as well. But really, the big teams were not imposing. Obviously, that had been reversed at the start of the 70s. We'd seen Johan Cruyff, Johan Neeskens. We'd seen Netzer and Breitner go to Real Madrid. The power was there again, but it wasn't converting itself into performances of the top sides. I think domestically, Real Madrid was still very strong, but we were starting to see the emergence of Real Sociedad as being an alternative force in Spanish football. In particular, I mean, they had a tremendous goalkeeper, Arconada. I think he was perceived at the time as being one of the best in the world, maybe the best even. He was very much in the conversation with people like Fijol of Argentina, Shilton, Clemens, Zoff, and he was a real foundation point for them. I think they had some quality at the back. They were still quite rugged, though. I think Spain defensively. I think that was the feel of the era. I think we often now certainly imagine Spanish teams as being very technical, as having lots of these little schemers, in the sort of Xavi and Iniesta and David Silva mold. And it wasn't really like that. They had some good technical players. The captain, Asensi, was out of form. They had Santillana as an attacker who was renowned as being a superb header of the ball. And I think they had some quality players there. Migueli at centre-back was seen as being a real warrior, would go on to be a really big player for Barcelona. But I don't think they were seen as being among the best sides in the world, even if they did have quite a lot of quality in the squad.
So now let's get into the tournament. The tournament kicked off on June 11th at Rome with the replay of the 1976 final, with West Germany taking on Czechoslovakia. What would be a running theme for this tournament was the very low turnout. There was like 11,000 in attendance. For this match, Derval started in a cautious way and with four midfielders, and Stilicke played in midfield. We will get back to why that's important for later on during the tournament. It would be a disappointing match that was only settled with Rummenigge scoring off of a cross by Hansi Müller. Afterwards, both managers blamed the heat and tensions, etc. Venglos went on and actually blamed his goalkeeper, Jaroslav Netolika, for his positioning. Again, it would be not just a low turnout, but just the dire performance itself would be repeated throughout the tournament. And this was just an indication of things to come. On the same day at Naples, Holland took on Greece. This would be another low turnout affair, only 15,000 attendance, a match decided by a penalty kick with Kist scoring to give the Dutch the victory. On another side note about this, Dirk Nanninga, who was fouled for the penalty kick decision, he had to explain up to 27 times to journalists about his penalty kick foul.
Yeah, it was a really bizarre one, this, actually, because he was kind of off the ball. It wasn't off the ball, but he was chasing down. The ball had already gone, and the goalkeeper was judged to have tripped him up. And if you look at it back in highlights, I wouldn't say 27 times, but you need to watch it quite a few times to really work out what's going on, because he's going in, he falls over, and you're just like, as he goes to chase down a defender, and the goalkeeper had tripped him up. or was the judge to have tripped him up? So, I mean, this was a tournament, without getting too far ahead of ourselves. There were a lot of soft penalties, I would say. I'm not saying that this one particularly was soft in itself, but there were a lot of very difficult ones where we really could have done with VAR to work out if the fouls had happened inside the box or outside the box. There's a lot of ones where you have to really look at them and you're like, was that inside or outside? So it was and as you say, though, the poor games, these ones. And unfortunately as well, the story of the tournament, there were a lot of poor games which were poorly attended in it. So yeah, certainly can move on from that.
3 days later, on June 14th at Naples, West Germany and Holland faced each other for the third tournament. Obviously, they had met in the 1974 final, also 1978 World Cup. So this was the third major tournament they were facing each other. The attendance was somewhat better, 30,000, but it's still far less than what one would expect these days for a match between two such powerhouses. Importantly for the Germans, this would be the match where Joop Derwall would make tactical modifications, which would help him for the rest of the tournament. Bernd Kuhlmann, he was dropped as libero, with Stielicke dropping back from midfield to be the new libero. Bernd Forster was also dropped in midfield and replaced by Bernd Schuster, who would be one of the major stars of this tournament, like you mentioned earlier. This allowed the attack to be a three-man attack with Hrubesch, Rummenigge, and Klaus Allofs. For this match, Allofs and Schuster would be stars of this match. Allofs would score a hat-trick, with Schuster being involved in setting all three of them up. The Germans had a 3-0 lead and seemed in total control at this point. One significant aspect of this match was also the introduction and the international debut of the 19-year-old Lothar Matthäus, who would become an international star and a staple of European football for the next 2 decades. Actually, he gave away a penalty kick. Rep scored from a spot to give the Dutch a lifeline, and Willy van der Kerkhoff also pulled another goal back. The scoreline was somewhat deceiving with the 3-2 scoreline, as the Germans were effectively in control throughout this match.
Yeah, this was the good game of the tournament, basically. This was the one, without trying to spoil things. This was a very good game. As you say, I think the Germans were in control. Allofs had a great game. Schuster was really good, I think, in this tournament. And weirdly, but I mean, he only played 2 games, without getting ahead of ourselves. He picked up a booking in this game. Therefore, he didn't play in the final group games. He only played 1 group game. And, you look back on the sort of great players of the European Championship, and he only played 2 games. So it's a really, really weird one. Allofs was clinical in this game, put his chances away. The Dutch came back, didn't really threaten at 3-2. Bit of a weird one, in that you thought it would be the sort of the cavalry charge and they would have won it from, gone on and really threatened. They didn't. This was another one where the penalty, as you say, Lothar Matthäus gave away a penalty. Very difficult to tell if it was inside the box or outside the box. Happy to give the Dutch the benefit of the doubt here. But yeah, this was a really good game. Lots of goals, in contrast to a lot of the others.
Later that same day at Rome, Czechoslovakia took on Greece again in front of only 8,000 fans. For this match, Venglos, who had blamed Netolica for his error versus West Germany, started with Stanislav Seman in goal. The Czechs were much stronger. Panenka scored from a free kick. The Greeks tied the match in the 14th minute through Anastopoulos. Vizek scored a second goal midway through the first half, and Nehoda scored another goal in the second half to give Czechs a comfortable win. Despite the win and the score, it's still not a memorable match that many people would remember. The other takeaway from this match was that after the match, the Greek reporters attacked the Greek manager, Alketas Panagoulias, for not starting Galakos in this match. Panagoulias actually had a physical scuffle with Stavro Sotros, who was a former player but was now a journalist at this point. Not a memorable tournament for Greece. Now we come to the final matches in this group on June 17th. At Milan, the Dutch faced Czechoslovakia. Again, in front of another low crowd, 12,000. The Czech scored first in the 16th minute, and the Dutch tied the match in the second half through Kist. Not a memorable match, 1-1 tie match. This basically drew the curtain on the golden generation of Holland, as they would not participate for another tournament until the 1988 Euros with Gullit and Van Basten. Later that day at Turin, Germany faced Greece in an inconsequential match. Schuster had received a yellow card against the Dutch. Darrell chose to rest him. As a result, he also chose to give a rest to Alofs and Dietz so that they would not risk a yellow card themselves. Again, it was not a dour match, ended up as a scoreless tie. Germany, they just needed a tie to advance, so they just went through the motions.
The classic in terms of, at this point in time, we still didn't have simultaneous scheduling for the final group games. So Germany knew what they needed to do, which was get a draw, and they did it, which obviously in 1982 would come through in terms of the game that they had with Austria, the famous game in Gijón. But yeah, certainly demonstrated the flaws here as well. And they never wanted to win the game. They didn't need to win the game. They managed the game. And the Czechs, who would have, I think, gone through had Greece won this, were left out, basically.
Another side story, 2 hours before the match, there was a bomb crank call made to West Germany's hotel. Now we come to Group B. Their matches started on June 12th at Turin, with England taking on Belgium. Again, another low turnout of just 15,000. Leading up to this match, actually, Belgium had threatened strike because the players wanted double their bonuses that were offered by the federation. The federation threatened the players with a 3-year ban. In the end, Wilfred van Moer convinced the squad to negotiate. A compromise was made to get a bit more, but obviously not double that they were requesting. This match between England and Belgium would be remembered for the hooliganism. Talking about the match, England took the lead in the 26th minute with the very beautiful goal by Wilkins that's much referenced and replayed to this day, with a double lob, basically lobbing the advancing defense and then lobbing Faf. Belgium would tie the match just 4 minutes later through Keulemans. It was after this that apparently, according to some observers, the Italian fans cheered the Belgian goal, and this enraged the English fans, and fighting broke out in the stands. The Italian police fired tear gas into the crowd. Even on the field, Ray Clemens was affected with the tear gas. England manager Ron Greenwood actually appealed to the UEFA officials to stop the match. And the play was actually stopped, I believe, for like 5 minutes before it was restarted. The match ended as a 1-1 tie, but obviously it's the events on the stands that are mostly remembered. England were fined, and I was surprised to learn that there were only, I don't know if this is true, but they were only fined £8,000 for the disturbances, which seems like a paltry sum, but I'm not sure. Was this like a minimum at the time? Who knows? I don't know.
Well, I think even to this day, the fines are incredibly low when you do get these things. You know, for a tournament which these days, which are generating hundreds of millions of pounds, I think often, you know, it will be something similar. You know, your players or fans have been completely out of control. It's a £25,000 fine. You know, well, the players are earning that in you know, a day. Yeah. So if not quicker. So.
Later that day, the host Italy took on Spain in Milan with an attendance of 50,000, which was satisfactory, but obviously, again, falls short of what one would expect. This match ended as a scoreless tie. The takeaway was, I think Spain came close with Juanito striking the post with a free kick. But again, another dire match. The Italian crowd shouted "Buffones, Buffones" at the Italian club officials because of a Totonera scandal. Bierzot reassured the best was yet to come, but that was not to be. 3 days later, on June 15th, Belgium took on Spain in front of only 11,000 fans. Belgium would win 2-1. Gerrits would score in the 17th minute. Spain would tie the match with Kini in 36th minute, and Julian Kruls would score Belgium's winner in the 65th minute. Later that day in Turin, Italy took on England. Because of the incidents during the Belgium-England match, there was massive police presence. The mayor of Turin had actually threatened to cancel this match and had banned the sale of alcohol inside the stadium. This was a match that Italy had to win. They would score the winner through Tardelli in the 78th minute. England were more or less out after this result. After the match, there was some controversy when Kevin Keegan was quoted in Italian sports paper, Tuttosport, accusing the Romanian referee Nicola Regna of bribery. The exact quote that was attributed to him was that nobody can take it out of my mind that he had accepted money. However, Keegan maintained that this was a misquote, and eventually the journalist in question admitted to misquoting him and apologized. This set the stage for Italy facing Belgium for a decider. At this point, Belgium had a better goal difference going to this last match. But before that, on June 18th, England faced Spain at Naples, and both teams at this point were already more or less eliminated. There were many changes with both teams. Trevor Brooking gave England the lead. Spain tied the match in the 48th minute through Danny Ruiz. England would score their winner in the 61st minute through Woodcock. So we come to the deciding match of the group on the same day at Rome, with Italy facing Belgium. Belgium had decided to just hold on for a tie. They got it in the end and moved to the final, the scoreless tie. Italy were out, the hosts were out. For the final four, we have the third place match between hosts Italy and Czechoslovakia as group runner-ups, and West Germany and Belgium for the final. So the third place match would be on June 21st at Naples. Again, with a low turnout of 25,000. That was probably understandable given that the hosts were no longer in the running to win the title. This match would end as a 1-1 tie. The Czechs would take the lead through Jurkemik in the 54th minute. And Francesco Graziani would tie the match in the 73rd minute. This match is remembered for the marathon penalty kick session afterwards, that ended 9-8.
Get a goal in this game as well from Jurkemik. The opener is a hell of a goal. It's one of the great goals in European Championship history. He comes onto a corner, I think, and absolutely lashes it into the top corner, underlining again Zoff's susceptibility from some of the long shots, I would say. But it's not really very well remembered because it happened in a bit of a nothing game.
Yes. And incidentally, this is the very last third place match. After this, the third place match was scrapped from subsequent Euros. We come to the final the next day, June 22nd, at Rome, between West Germany and Belgium. Schuster, Dietz, and Alofs are back in the lineup. West Germany stick to their 4-3-3 formation. Again, for a final, this was a low turnout of only 48,000. This would be the match where Horst Hrubesch would take center stage. The West Germans would take the lead in the 10th minute when Schuster found Hrubesch at the edge of the box, who chested his pass and shot past Pfaff. The West Germans would keep this lead for most of the match until the 72nd minute, where Belgium would earn a penalty kick. René van der Eycken would score. This match appeared to be headed for a 1-1 tie when, with 2 minutes remaining, the West Germans had a corner on the left side. Karl-Heinz Rummenigge took the corner and Hrubesch scored the header to give West Germany their win and their second Euros, the first since 1972. Afterwards, Gittes acknowledged that the West Germans were better and worthy winners. Derval's praise was in fixing the mistake from the first match, the tactical reshuffle of moving Stielicke back into the libero position and unleashing Schuster in midfield. Many saw as the reason for West Germany's success. Also, along with Schuster, you had other revelations like Alofs, Hrubesch, or even Hans-Peter Briegel. The journalists, this was the team that they selected as the team of the tournament. Luis Arconada in goal. For defenders, you have Claudio Gentile, Ruud Krol, Fulvio Colovati, and Manfred Kaltz. In midfield, you have Schuster, Wilfried van Moer, and Hansi Müller. Up front, you have Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Klaus Alofs, and Jan Keulemans. What do you think about this team?
I think the attacking positions are about right, probably. I think there are some ones in there. Rummenigge, Keulemans, Van Moer, Schuster, I think are probably the standout players of this tournament. For me, I think the defensive ones, it's sometimes I'm never quite sure with these ones if they just pick the names that they're most famous. Because, you look at those and you're like, well, actually, I mean, did Arconada, I think he went into it as being hailed as being one of the best. I don't know he had a terrific tournament. Although at the same time, I don't know who did particularly. This was the tournament. It's really hard to pick out. It's true of a few Euros, particularly when there's so few games, who really played particularly well. But I think I wouldn't have any particular issues with it or any clear omissions.
Italy manager Enzo Bierzot was also asked to select his team of the tournament, and he intentionally did not choose any Italian players for his team. He chose Ray Clements, Dave Watson, Ruud Krol, Eric Gerets, Manfred Kaltz, František Stambach of Czechoslovakia, Ray Wilkins, Hansi Müller, Kevin Keegan, Zdeněk Nehoda, and Karl-Heinz Rummenigge.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, obviously for a manager, he's understandably picked the players that he probably saw. He had enough on his plate, I would imagine, in terms of preparing Italy for it. So yeah, I can see where he's coming from there.
Overall, as we've already discussed to some extent, the spectacle had been a disappointing one. Hardly any match. Maybe the Holland-Germany, as you mentioned, would be considered as a classic or a game that's actually remembered today. And relatively few players had emerged as stars. What are your thoughts on the tournament overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you say, it was quite an underwhelming one. It's a real shame, really, because as I say, 76 was a tremendous tournament, and I'd really urge people to, if they haven't, go back and watch some of that because it's a great one. This one, less so. The highlights do it justice. I think there's not a lot there. There's quite a few games which are absolutely barren. Nobody's even interested in scoring a goal, to be honest. So it's not great. At the same time, there are some really important players who do emerge. I think Schuster, it's a shame, real shame, without getting ahead of ourselves, that he didn't have much more of a career with West Germany. He's quite a temperamental character. The West German Federation at this time had a habit of annoying important players and having frictions between some of their top stars and the Federation. Keulemans, I think, as well came through and became a star. I think this further made certain of Rummenigge's place as the sort of preeminent player in Europe at this point. So yeah, I think it was a bit of a disappointing tournament. There were some good performances, but they were relatively few and far between.
The main talking point was the poor attendances. many speculated that the Italians, in a way, boycotted the tournament in protest over the Totonero scandal. Do you think the spectacle would have been better with more fans?
I think it would have been. I think as well at the time, Italy had quite sort of creaking set of stadiums at this point in time, which were pretty much wholly overhauled for the 1990 World Cup 10 years later. As well, world football, and certainly football in Europe, was in a bit of a lull at this point. I kind of look at this sort of post-Cruyff era until you come through to the sort of prime of Maradona as being, there was a bit of a gap. We look at the sort of the top players this time, mentioned before, Keegan, Rummenigge, great players, but they're not ever spoken of in that sort of top echelon. I don't think Platini, although he was well regarded, obviously didn't play in this tournament, but I don't think he'd come through yet as being quite the player that he would go on to be at Juventus. So generally, I think the attendances were down. You look at the domestic attendances in England, despite the fact that English clubs were winning European Cups, they were really, really poor. And, in an era now when we've just broken the post-war attendance record, you're consistently seeing games of 70,000 or so, being sold out. The domestic attendances in general, people weren't going to football games. And I think this persists. I mean, this was a particular low, don't get me wrong, but it's not that much of an outlier, I think. And certainly we are in the era, though, where these days, even if the domestic fans weren't that interested, the Italians, you would imagine that would be augmented with travelling supporters. I mean, that wasn't particularly the case here, which in a way makes some of the criticisms about the English hooliganism, not to gloss over that, a little bit overstated. It's not like they were travelling in enormous numbers. So, yeah, it was a disappointing tournament. The spectacle would have been a lot better, but in a way, you can't blame the fans when you look at the quality of football which was being served up as well.
And just for record, the most spectators were present for the Italy-England match, which was just under 60,000. And the fewest spectators were for the Czechoslovakia-Greece match with just under 8,000.
I'll just say one thing on the Italy-England match, which we didn't touch on, which if everyone remembers Marco Tardelli's celebration from the 1982 World Cup, if you haven't seen his celebration in this game for a goal that he scores late on from close range, it makes the one from 1982 look quite subdued. He really does really go for it. It's one of the great celebrations, and worth looking that one up on YouTube if you haven't seen it.
So looking back, how are these Euros regarded historically? Is it simply as a bridge to the modern era with the introduction of a group phase?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's the notable addition here, and it's a huge addition. I think I absolutely love the European Championships, and it's such a fan of this tournament. I think this was a sweet spot that it got into with these two groups. It was a really important step forward in terms of establishing it as being not necessarily a challenger to the World Cup, but really locking in its place as being the second most important tournament. And I think as throughout the 80s, it really grew in importance, and we see that coming through in terms of some great tournaments to follow. I think the football in this one is by and large best forgotten. There's not a lot of great performances in there. Even the best game, the Netherlands, West Germany, it has goals. It doesn't have the thrill in quite the same way that you might expect from some of the great games we'd see. So, yeah, not a tournament which we will particularly live long in the memory of all that many, I would say.
Yeah, one quirk of this tournament was the fact that it didn't have any semi-finals. Do you think that might have improved the tournament? I mean, there were a couple of dead games, which seems strange in a tournament that's got so few games anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a real shame, actually, that there wasn't that. And I think, actually, if we look back through Euros history, so many of the best games, and the World Cup, so many of the best games are the semi-finals. It's not got quite the edge of the World Cup final or the European Championship final. And therefore, some of those great games, in 4 years' time, there's the France-Portugal game, which is arguably the best game in tournament history. And there's quite a few great semi-finals, not so many great finals, and missing that really does feel like it. I mean, the great innovation that we got rid of after this was the third, fourth playoff, which is the biggest waste of time in football, really. Nobody wants to be playing for third, fourth. So that was a welcome reduction in the next edition of this.
In closing, this new format of the Euros would really take off with the 1984 edition in France. What changed in 4 years for this increase in interest and performance and attendance?
Well, I mean, again, similar to this one, I mean, France, if I can say in a word, it would be Platini. I mean, I think he was absolutely phenomenal in the following tournament in a way that nobody caught light in this tournament. He scored 9 goals in 5 games in what's probably the best, well, almost certainly the best performance in Euros history. But he was on his own quite exceptional. I mean, it's interesting, you say the sort of the increase in interest without getting onto it, potentially cover this in the future. It was a tournament wasn't fully covered on TV in England. So there wasn't, I think sometimes we do look back and think that there was this incredible focus in the way that we focus on the World Cups and the Euros now, which wasn't quite there. But I think that there were more positive teams. We see the emergence of Denmark as being a force in the next one. Belgium were good. Yugoslavia were good. It was a great group that there was. And I think this was a particular low in football. It was very defensive at this point in time. And I think it's hard to put a finger on a single thing, but I think Platini really did illuminate that tournament in a way that is hard to replicate.
With that, we look forward to future tournaments. Once again, we would like to thank Mr. Fielder for his participation in this interview. For any questions and comments, you may contact us. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify and now Google, Apple, and Stitcher, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. Fielder's contact info, his Twitter, and his book links are all listed on this blog and podcast listings. So, Mr. Fielder, thank you once again.
Thanks very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.